Welcome. A few weeks ago, in what was hailed as a major victory for gay rights movements and advocates around the country, two Supreme Court actions happened. And what does this mean for those of us who subscribe to Orthodox Christian values? Well, Richard Munzinger, a prominent attorney and man of faith, is with us to discuss the implications of these landmark decisions. Welcome, Richard.
Glad to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking time out from your busy schedule. I know you're involved in so many different things, but what exactly was this ruling that came down from the Supreme Court? A couple different things happened, right?
A page of history.
Uh-huh.
The Defense of Marriage Act was enacted by Congress in 1996 precisely because there was a movement afoot to recognize homosexual marriage. And it was designed to do two things. One, to control the definition of marriage and to insulate the states from the full faith and credit obligation of the American Constitution to honor homosexual marriage if some state enacted it as law and other states didn't want to follow it. And that's what the Defense of Marriage Act was.
So it is done kind of as a preventative measure, if you will, toward homosexuality becoming...
To protect against mandatory recognition of homosexual marriage by states that didn't want to have it, and in the case of one part of the statute, by the federal law.
Okay. And so essentially, what did the ruling do? It struck that down, or it did an end run around it? What did it do exactly?
There are two sections to the law that are of importance. One defined marriage and spouse, so that marriage was defined to mean the marriage of a man and a woman, and spouse was defined to mean man and woman. And that definition, that part of the statute amended what's called the Federal Dictionary Act, which defines words for many, many federal laws, so that any federal law that had marriage meant marriage between a man and a woman, spouse meant man or wife, depending upon the context. That was Section 2. Section 3 said no state may be forced to honor the law of another state if it's against its public policy regarding marriage. I'm paraphrasing.
Right.
The case came about because two women who had had a relationship since the 1960s, they lived in New York. One of them grew ill. They decided they wanted to marry. They could not marry in New York, so they went to Canada, I think to Toronto. They married in Toronto, returned to New York City. One woman died. The other left her entire estate. The woman who died left the entire estate to her partner, spouse, under Canadian law. New York recognized homosexual marriage, but the United States did not because of this definition of spouse. So the woman who survived had to pay the United States of America $360,000 in estate taxes, whereas had she been a man whose wife died or a woman whose husband died, she would have been entitled to take advantage of the marital exception and not have to pay that tax.
I see.
And that's what brought the case to the courts.
Mm-hmm. And so by striking down the Defense of Marriage Act, basically that enables kind of any definition of marriage to occur, or just same-sex marriage to occur? Or am I being simplistic?
No, I think you probably have it right. I think that a state could define marriage however the state wanted to, whether it's polygamist or two men, two women, whatever it would be. I think that the law of a state would have to be recognized.
Mm-hmm. And so why was this such a blow to the whole issue of same-sex marriage, or to maintaining the standard of traditional marriage? Why was it such a blow?
I think it's more of what lies in the future is the primary concern of people, although obviously the majority in Congress that passed this law was 300 and some odd of the 400 and some odd legislators, plus it was signed by the president, who at the time, of course, was, I believe, Bill Clinton. So
that was the Defense of Marriage Act.
The Defense of Marriage Act.
Right.
And so only one part of it was stricken by this case. That's Section 2. Section 3, pertaining to the states, remains on the books. But that's what I think bothers most people, and certainly bothered those who dissented, Justice Scalia and others. There were 4 justices who dissented, led by Scalia. They all recognized that what lies in the future is going to be possibly the claim that if New York recognizes homosexual marriage, Texas must honor a New York marriage, and Texas has a constitutional provision. Article 1, Section 32 of the Texas Constitution says, marriage in this state shall consist only of the union of one man and one woman. This state or a political subdivision of this state may not create or recognize any legal status identical or similar to marriage. So that forestalls homosexual marriage, civil unions, and the Texas Family Code forbids courts from enforcing a marriage or recognizing a marriage between 2 people of the same sex. There are 2 cases presently pending before the Texas Supreme Court on that issue. So that what bothers people most is that even though Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act still is on the books, the next case that comes up will involve Section 3, and the same 5 justices of the Supreme Court will tell the people of the rest of the country that you have to recognize same-sex marriage. At least if it is done in New York. If the people come to Texas, you have to treat them as married people. That is not the law today.
Right, which is kind of chaotic, right? I mean, it's very difficult to do.
It's chaotic, except, as Justice Scalia said, the Constitution begins with the words, we the people. Authority comes from people, not from judges. And that was his argument. You judges have taken away the right of the people to control their own living circumstances and to create a society that they want. You are telling us that we have to have a society the way you want it, not the way we want it, just like abortion.
Right.
Same thing as abortion.
Right. Now, this also, didn't this case also happen in relationship to Proposition 8 in California, which was passed by the people of California, which was against gay marriage at the time, or homosexual marriage, and then the California Supreme Court struck it down? I mean, I don't know the exact.
Well, before the United States Supreme Court, there were 2 cases. The first that you and I have been talking about is a case called United States versus Windsor. And at the same time that the court decided Windsor, it decided a case from California called Hollingsworth versus Perry. The background of the Hollingsworth versus Perry case from California is that the people of California, in response to a Supreme Court opinion holding that laws forbidding homosexual marriage were unconstitutional, passed Proposition 8, which made them unconstitutional, and told the court that it had made a mistake. A majority of Californians, and a substantial majority of Californians, voted to enact Proposition 8. A federal judge in California had held that law to be, that Proposition 8 to be unconstitutional under the federal Constitution. Governor Schwarzenegger and the Attorney General of California, who I think was Jerry Brown, but it may not have been Jerry Brown, it might have been somebody else, I'm sorry about that, but neither the governor nor the Attorney General of California would appeal the case. They were happy that Proposition 8 had been defeated because they had sought to defeat it at the polls, but the people had passed it. The people who were, California law has a provision that says the people who are behind one of these propositions may attempt to enforce it in court. And so those people appealed to the Ninth Circuit, which is very liberal, and affirmed the federal district court, and then they took it to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court said, we don't have any jurisdiction over this case because the people who are bringing the case do not have standing. Standing is a legal concept. The courts can only allow a person who has been harmed by some action that the person is complaining of that the court can cure. If you don't meet those 3 criteria, you have no standing. And these people were not elected government officials. They couldn't enforce the law. All they could do would be to defend their proposition before the courts of California. And so the Supreme Court of the United States said there is no appeal before us to determine whether Proposition 8 is constitutional or not constitutional. The effect of that is to leave it as it is now. There is a court judgment saying it's unconstitutional, so Proposition 8 is a dead letter because the government will not enforce it.
Now, is this a good or a bad thing for Christians?
Well, I would rather live in a country that honored traditional marriage. I think that's natural. I think it's what God intended in Genesis. A man shall cleave to his wife, leave his home and cleave to his wife, and man and woman become one human being. He didn't say that about men, and it's obvious why. If you look at males and females, they are intended to reproduce. In Genesis, he says, go, swarm over the earth, increase and multiply. And I love the translation that says swarm over the earth. Swarm like ants, like bees. Make people. I love people, he says, and swarm over the earth. Well, if that's what marriage is all about, two men can't have a child and two women can't have a child. And it's kind of silly, in my opinion, for them to say, we want to have a family like others. Well, make one. You can't make a family if you're homosexuals. I don't denigrate their same-sex attraction. I don't suffer from it. My heart goes out to them. I don't believe that it is created into them. I don't pass judgment on them. It's not my place to pass judgment. It's God's. But I want to live in a place where each child should have a mother and a father, or at least the opportunity to have a mother and a father. We all benefit from both. Each boy has a feminine side that's taught to him by his mother. Each girl learns from her father, and those who don't have that arrangement, I think, they suffer for it. We're too early in the sociological history of that relationship, in my opinion, to know, although there have been studies that have said it's good for you, and there have been studies that have said that it's bad for you, but time will tell, and I can't believe that God knows how to design something better than men do.
Right. Well, in terms of looking at the social implications of these rulings, people say, well, you know, according to a Pew Charitable Trust poll, they said that more and more people are open to the concept of gay marriage, primarily because they know people who are gay, and they don't want to, you know, judge them, condemn them, or say you're wrong in having this desire, because it becomes a personal issue for them. And so what are the societal implications? Is it okay, you know, what if two people, gay people, two men, two women, want to be married? What does that mean in terms of people who are not gay? Is that okay, or not in favor of that?
Well, I'm not a sociologist, and so I don't know the long-term effects of it. My personal belief is that when God created man, male and female, he made them for the purpose of reproducing. That's why Jesus said there's no sex in heaven. There's not marriage. You're neither given in marriage nor is there marriage in heaven. Why? Because there are no children. There's no need for children. You can't have children in heaven. And so I think a man and a woman is the natural relationship, and I don't think, you just look, if you say two men can marry and you recognize their marriage, then why can't two men adopt?
Which is what's happening.
Well, of course, they adopt. I see it in California. When I go to California, I see these fellows with their, quote, children, close quote. Two men can adopt a child of the same sex with that same sex attraction. The Catholic Church has been, I'm Catholic so I can say this, it's been decimated by homosexual priests. Almost 9 of 10, 8.6 or something like that of the cases involve male on male sex. It's a homosexual problem in the Catholic priesthood.
You mean, you're talking about the molestation issues?
Yes, sure. Right. So I'm going to allow two men to adopt a child and take the risk that child becomes their target? That I don't think that's correct.
Well, you know, you said it, not me, from that standpoint. I mean, that the whole molestation issue with the Catholic Church is a very raw subject. I lived in New England when that whole thing came out, and we had a number of parishioners who were affected by that. And it is the thing that's unspoken, which is usually young males are the target of that. But you know, even that aside, societally speaking, once homosexuality becomes a legal standard and an alternative to you know, a role model for lifestyle, does that then affect the educational curriculums and what textbooks are portraying, and licensing. So, for example, if I were a therapist and I didn't believe in homosexuality, could I not be licensed because of that? Does it begin to infiltrate in other areas when a same-sex marriage becomes legal in the law of the state of the land?
You know, that remains to be seen, and I don't know I know in Washington State there is a law which makes it illegal to discriminate against people because of their sexual attractions, and there are cases in Washington where a baker, for example, refused to make the wedding cake for two homosexuals who wanted to marry. He refused. That was held to be discrimination. I don't know if it was a crime or it was a civil action. I believe it to have been a civil action, but the person could be sued. The same for a florist. I think there's a case in Washington involving a florist. Well, I look at myself, and let's just assume for a moment that I am a Roman Catholic who follows the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, that homosexual sex is forbidden and shouldn't be honored, and that homosexuality is an objective disorder. That's the words of the Catholic Catechism. Should I, as a Catholic baker, be required to participate in a homosexual wedding even though I believe it to be immoral, if not amoral? Should I, as a Catholic florist, have to swallow my beliefs to honor the beliefs of two other people? It doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, I think there can be some serious problems that could arise from this down the road. Whether or not it will remains to be seen.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the whole the rulings, then, so the Defense of Marriage Act was something that allowed the states the freedom to decide how they would define marriage themselves, or it defined marriage for the federal government? How did that work?
From the beginning of the country, federal law has recognized that the question of marriage is for the states to decide. The federal government never has allowed there to be divorces in federal courts. There is no federal law of marital relations. It's all up to the states. So the federal government simply was, in the past, would simply say, if A and B were married in Nevada, the federal government, if it was a valid marriage in Nevada, the federal government will recognize it as a valid marriage. When homosexual marriage began to be bandied about as a possibility, that's when Congress enacted the Defense of Marriage Act, saying the federal government will not recognize the marriage of two people of the same sex. And that was in Section 2. The threat to the rest of us is in Section 3. Let me just read real quickly from the Constitution. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state, and the Congress may by general laws prescribe the manner in which such acts, records, and proceedings shall be proved and the effect thereof. That's called the full faith and credit clause, so that a judgment in a case in New York, for example, A sues B and gets a judgment for money. B owns property in Texas. A brings the judgment to Texas and says, I want to take away this fellow's property to pay my judgment. The Texas courts, under the federal Constitution, must give full faith and credit to the New York judgment. Well, now you see the Section 2 of the Defense of Marriage Act says states don't have to recognize a marriage of people of the same sex. But if the Supreme Court can hold Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional, why can't they hold the other section unconstitutional? So it may just be a short period of time before the Supreme Court tells all the United States that you must recognize homosexual marriage in your courts and in every other way, because if New York recognizes them, the full faith and credit clause requires that Texas recognize them. That doesn't mean Texas would have to have homosexual marriages of its own. It just means that if two people came from New York, there's a case pending before the Texas Supreme Court right now. Two people, women, were married in Massachusetts under the Massachusetts same-sex marriage law. So their marriage is recognized in Massachusetts. They move to Texas. One files for a divorce. No Texas court may take such a case because Texas does not recognize, and its family code forbids courts from taking such a case. A judge in Dallas took the case anyway, and it's gone through the courts, and it's on appeal before the Texas Supreme Court, has been there for a couple of years now. I suspect we'll get an answer. I think the Texas Supreme Court was waiting for the United States Supreme Court to act on the Defense of Marriage Act before it pronounced its opinion in this case. There are two cases before the Texas Supreme Court involving marriage, out-of-state marriages of people of the same sex.
So how does the Supreme Court's actions affect this Texas case now that you said they were waiting?
Well,
how would it affect that?
The case that was just decided does not affect that case, except that it says to all of us, the logic of the case that was just decided applies in spades to the other section of the Defense of Marriage Act. If it's unconstitutional for Congress to say that a man and a man and a man can't marry, why is it constitutional for Texas to say they can't marry and therefore deprive New York citizens who are validly married in New York of their rights as husband and husband? That it raises a real problem, and that's what Justice Scalia and the dissenters were saying. They're saying you guys are setting this up, and Scalia's, if anybody really wants to read a wonderful dissent, you need to read Scalia's dissent. It's just raw power is what he says, and they're...
What was it that he said, what were his major objections? What was he expressing for those who dissented?
Well, he didn't address the sexual issue. He addressed a federal procedural issue. The Constitution says we have three departments of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. The judicial may only take cases and controversies. There has to be a real fight between people in court before the court can answer a question. And his point was, in the Defense of Marriage Act case, there was no real fight. The President and the Attorney General of the United States said, we aren't going to enforce this law. And when it went up on appeal from the trial court, the federal government, which was the petitioner, said, we're happy, affirm this judgment, as did the other side. That's not an argument. And so Scalia said, you, the Supreme Court, he said, you are hungry to pronounce on this case because they wanted to expand their power and they wanted to accomplish this societal change. Those five don't want to let you and I vote how we change our society. They're going to tell us. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're familiar with the magazine First Things, but it's a magazine of religion in the public square. Some years ago, they had a symposium of people who said, we are really not free. The Supreme Court tells us what we have to do, and that's the truth. Mm-hmm. So now we're told that we have to accept, even though our Congress and our president say we don't have to accept same-sex marriage, you five say that we do, but we didn't vote for you. No, we don't vote for those judges. Mm-hmm. They're appointed.
Right. Well, have you seen more and more of this judicial activism occurring over time, or you think it's increased, or this is just the Supreme Court barreling along as it has for quite a while?
Well, I'm only 75, and my experience is limited. But since the Warren Court, obviously, at least in my opinion, there's been a good deal more judicial activism and judicial arrogance, in my opinion.
Right. Now, what should be the reaction of Christians to the Defense of Marriage Act basically being disemboweled, if you will, and it's eventually probably going to happen? How can we as Christians, what can we do practically and spiritually from our standpoint?
I think we have to pray practically, quit voting for liberals. Mm-hmm. I'm stunned. I saw in the paper the other day an elected public official stand up and proudly proclaim her Catholicism and yet fight for abortion, against this abortion statute. I'm a Catholic, as I say. Catholics vote for liberals. 50 to 60% vote for liberals, notwithstanding that they are for abortion, that they are for homosexual marriage. They are for things that stand Western civilization on its head. Mm-hmm. The Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be a self-evident truth. Mm-hmm. All people are created by their Creator, God, with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life. And yet we live in a country where 5 people, almost all, that would be an exaggeration, many appointed by liberal presidents and affirmed by liberal senators, to allow abortion, the killing of a human being. It's the killing of a human being. Mm-hmm. And these people vote for that. I mean, the only thing that you can do on a practical level is quit voting for liberals.
Mm-hmm. Right. So there you have it. Okay. Well, when we think about this whole issue of homosexuality and the public square and our role as Christians, we really need to reflect on what Richard Munzinger has said and the Defense of Marriage Act. And so, do you think that we need to be praying that somehow God will turn this situation around, or that perhaps we can be more effective witnesses to Jesus Christ and His truth, and therefore transform individual lives? What is your perspective on this? We really want to hear from you. Please contact us on Facebook, Twitter, or our website. Thank you so much for watching.